They laughed the moment he opened his mouth. Not because he was rude. Not because he was angry. But because of what he said next. "I want to withdraw $1 billion, the farmer said quietly. The banker looked up. The businessman waiting behind him chuckled. Even the security guard shifted his weight, smiling to himself. A man in worn sandals. Sunburned skin. Hands cracked from years of working the land. 1 billion. But before the sun would set, that same businessman would be shaking, the banker would be begging for forgiveness, and the farmer would teach them a lesson money alone cannot buy. Stay with me. Because this is not a story about wealth. It is a story about who truly owns power. Who was this farmer, really? Why did he walk into a bank meant only for elites? And how did a simple request expose a lie the city had lived with for decades? Was the billionaire businessman wrong to laugh? Or was there something hidden beneath the farmer's silence? Because some people carry their riches in their pockets. Others carry them in their names, their past, and their patience. And when those two worlds collide, someone always falls. Have you ever been judged by your appearance? Have you ever watched someone underestimate you, only to realize later they made the biggest mistake of their life? That's exactly what happened here. And what makes this story shake you to your core is how real it is. How easily it could happen to any of us. They called him Ezekiel Moore. For 40 years, Ezekiel lived on the same stretch of land his father left him, a quiet valley outside the city, where the soil was dark and generous. He woke before dawn. Spoke little. Worked endlessly. To outsiders, he was just another farmer. But to those who watched closely, Ezekiel never borrowed money. Never begged for help. Never complained when drought came or floods followed. When others sold their land during hard times, Ezekiel bought, quietly. Not with loans. With cash. People whispered. Some mocked him. He doesn't even own a car, but he's buying land, they'd say at the local diner, shaking their heads over coffee. They didn't know his past. They didn't ask. And Ezekiel never told them. Years ago, Ezekiel had studied economics at a prestigious university on the East Coast. He wore the suits. Walked the halls of finance. Saw the gleam in men's eyes when they talked about deals, about crushing competitors, about winning at any cost. He watched his classmates become hollow. Watched his professors worship numbers more than people. And one day, during his senior year, he witnessed something that changed him forever. A family farm foreclosed. An elderly couple forced out. His professor celebrated it in class as efficient market correction. Ezekiel walked out that day and never returned. He chose soil over suits. Seeds over stocks. And while the city grew loud, Ezekiel grew invisible. He built something they couldn't see. Something that didn't need their validation. But invisibility has power. While others shouted about their success, Ezekiel quietly bought land from families in distress, always paying fair prices, always in cash, always with a handshake and a promise that their legacy wouldn't be forgotten. While bankers created complicated investment products that collapsed, Ezekiel invested in what never loses value: earth, water, food. He wasn't anti-wealth. He was anti-waste. He lived in a small farmhouse with a creaking porch, drove a 20-year-old truck that still ran perfectly, and ate meals he grew himself. His neighbors thought he was poor. His accountant knew differently. The question is, how would you live if you had that kind of wealth? Would you flaunt it? Or would you, like Ezekiel, choose silence and purpose over status and noise? Across town lived Richard Hale. Sharp suits. Loud laugh. Louder ego. Richard believed money was proof of intelligence. That wealth made a man superior. Banks bent their rules for him. People bowed. He drove cars that cost more than most people's homes. Wore watches that could feed a village for a year. And he loved reminding people of it. Not directly, of course. Richard was too clever for that. He'd casually mention his yacht. Drop names of politicians he golfed with. Let his designer shoes do the talking when he walked into a room. Richard had built his empire on real estate development, turning farmland into shopping centers, wetlands into luxury condolences, forests into parking lots. He called it progress. Others called it destruction. But Richard didn't care what others called it, as long as they called him Sir. That particular morning, Richard was at Grandstone Bank, the oldest and most exclusive financial institution in the state, to finalize funding for his largest project yet. A massive agricultural acquisition. Thousands of acres. Prime land. The kind of deal that would cement his legacy, he thought. He'd been working on it for months, pulling strings, making promises, greasing palms. The land belonged to several small farmers, and Richard's team had been quietly buying them out, one by one. Most had sold. A few held out. But Richard always won in the end. Always. He checked his Rolex. The meeting was scheduled for 9:30. He had 15 minutes. He stood in the marble hall of the bank, scrolling through his phone, barely aware of the people around him. Until he heard the words. $1 billion. Richard's head snapped up. Standing at the counter was a man who looked like he'd just walked off a tractor. Faded jeans. A plain cotton shirt with a small tear near the pocket. Sandals that had seen better years. Skin weathered by sun and wind. Richard's first instinct was confusion. How did this man even get past security? Grandstone Bank didn't serve just anyone. You needed a minimum account balance just to walk through the door. Richard smirked. This had to be some kind of mistake. Maybe the old man was confused. Maybe he meant 1,000. Maybe he'd wandered into the wrong building entirely. The banker behind the counter, a young man named Stephen with slick back hair and a too-tight tie, also looked confused. He smiled the way you smile at a child who says something silly. Sir, did you say, billion? The farmer nodded. I said what I said. Laughter rippled through the hall. Not cruel laughter, not yet, but the kind of laughter that comes from disbelief. Richard chuckled and leaned against a marble column, watching the scene unfold like it was street theater. A security guard near the entrance grinned. A well-dressed woman withdrawing cash whispered something to her assistant, and they both smiled. Stephen, the banker, cleared his throat, trying to maintain professionalism. Sir, perhaps there's been some confusion. Could you clarify what you're here for today? Ezekiel reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a worn envelope, the kind that used to come with birthday cards. He slid it across the counter. Inside was a single piece of paper with an account number written in blue ink. That's it. No fancy documents. No leather briefcase. Just a number. Stephen glanced at it, still smiling, and typed it into his computer. Probably to humor the old man, Richard thought. Probably to gently show him he had $30 in savings, not 30 billion. But then something shifted. Stephen's smile faded. His fingers stopped moving. His eyes widened slightly, just enough for Richard to notice. The banker leaned closer to the screen, as if he'd misread something. He typed the number again. Slower this time. And then his face went pale. Completely pale. He looked up at Ezekiel, then back at the screen, then at Ezekiel again. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Richard's smirk faded. What is it? He called out. Stephen didn't answer. He stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward and hitting the wall. Excuse me for just one moment, sir, he said to Ezekiel, his voice shaking slightly. Then he turned and walked quickly toward the back offices, almost jogging. Richard watched him go. The hall went quiet. Ezekiel stood at the counter, patient, hands folded, as if he had all the time in the world. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, back to what happened next, because what the banker saw on that screen changed everything. Within 2 minutes, Stephen returned. But he wasn't alone. Behind him was an older woman in a gray suit, Margaret Trask, the branch manager. Behind her, 2 more executives Richard recognized from business luncheons. Their faces were serious. Margaret walked directly to Ezekiel. She didn't smile. She didn't mock. She extended her hand. "Mr. Moore," she said quietly. "It's an honor. Please, come with me to a private office. We'll handle your request immediately." Richard blinked. "Mr. Moore. Private office? What was happening?" Ezekiel nodded and followed Margaret toward the back. As he passed Richard, their eyes met. Just for a second. Ezekiel's expression was calm. Unreadable. Richard felt something uncomfortable twist in his chest. Something he wasn't used to feeling. Doubt. The hall buzzed with whispers. Richard walked up to the counter where Stephen had returned, looking shaken. "What just happened?" Richard demanded. Stephen hesitated. I can't disclose client information, Mr. Hale." Richard leaned in closer. "Stephen. We've done business together for years. What did you see?" Stephen glanced around nervously, then whispered, "That man, his account, it's one of the oldest in the bank system. The balance." He trailed off, shaking his head. "How much?" Richard pressed. Stephen swallowed hard. "Enough to buy this entire building. Twice." Richard felt the floor tilt beneath him. That was impossible. A man dressed like that? A farmer? No. There had to be an error. A system glitch. Maybe the account was flagged for fraud. Maybe this was some kind of scam and the old man would be arrested any minute. Richard told himself that. Had to believe it. But deep down, a cold realization was beginning to creep in. He thought about the land acquisition. The parcels his team had been buying up. Most of the deeds had different names on them, small family farms, estates, trusts. But his legal team handled all that. Richard never looked closely at the names. He just signed where they told him to sign. His phone buzzed. A text from his lead attorney. "We have a problem. Call me now." Richard's hands went cold. He stepped outside the bank and dialed. His attorney, a sharp man named Davidson, answered on the first ring. "Richard, we need to halt the project." "What? Why?" "The land. We've been tracing the ownership for the funding paperwork, and there's a problem." Richard's jaw tightened. "What kind of problem?" Davidson sighed. 30% of the parcels we thought we'd acquired. They're not actually for sale. They're part of a larger trust. And the trust. Richard, it all traces back to one person. Richard's heart pounded. Who? A man named Ezekiel Moore. He's the primary landholder in the entire valley. We didn't catch it because the parcels are listed under different entities, family names, LLCs, but they all connect back to him. He's been buying up land for decades. Quietly. We can't move forward without his approval. And Richard, he's not selling. The phone almost slipped from Richard's hand. Ezekiel Moore. The man in the sandals. The man at the counter. The man in the private office right now, withdrawing $1 billion like it was a trip to the grocery store. Richard's entire project, the deal that was supposed to define his career, was falling apart. And the man who held all the cards had just watched him laugh. How would you feel in that moment? If you realized the person you mocked held your entire future in their hands? If your arrogance had just destroyed the biggest opportunity of your life. Richard felt something he hadn't felt in years. Fear. He walked back into the bank. His legs felt heavy. The hall that had seemed so comfortable minutes ago now felt like a trap. He saw Margaret and Ezekiel through the glass walls of a conference room. They were talking. Margaret was nodding, taking notes. Ezekiel sat calmly, hands folded on the table, speaking in that same quiet voice. Richard wanted to storm in. Wanted to demand answers. But he couldn't. Because for the first time in his life, Richard Hale had no power in the room. An hour passed. Richard waited. He told himself he had meetings to get to, calls to make, but he couldn't leave. He needed to understand what was happening. Finally, the conference room door opened. Ezekiel stepped out, followed by Margaret and two other senior executives. They shook his hand with a level of respect Richard had only seen reserved for foreign dignitaries. Ezekiel walked toward the exit. Richard stepped in front of him. "Excuse me," Richard said, his voice tight. "I think we need to talk." Ezekiel looked at him. Up close, Richard could see the lines around his eyes. The quiet strength in his posture. This was not a man who could be intimidated. "About what?" Ezekiel asked. Richard forced a smile. "I'm Richard Hale. I'm working on a development project in the valley. I believe you own some of the land we're interested in." Ezekiel nodded slowly. "I own most of it." Richard's smile faltered. "Right. Well, I'd love to discuss a partnership. Or perhaps a sale. I'm prepared to offer very competitive prices." Ezekiel studied him for a moment. Then he said, "You were laughing earlier." Richard blinked. I apologize if that offended you. It was just, unexpected." "What was unexpected?" Ezekiel asked. "That a man dressed like me could have money." Richard stammered. "No, look, let's start over. I'm sure we can work something out." Ezekiel shook his head. "You're not listening. I'm not selling. Not to you. Not to anyone like you." Richard's face flushed. "Anyone like me? What does that mean?" Ezekiel's voice remained calm, but his words cut deep. "It means men who see land as profit instead of legacy. Men who measure worth by appearance. Men who laugh first and think later." Richard opened his mouth to argue, but nothing came out. Because Ezekiel was right. And they both knew it. Ezekiel stepped past him and walked out of the bank. Richard stood there, frozen, as the weight of his mistake crushed him. By that evening, the news had spread. Quietly, the way these things do in elite circles. Ezekiel Moore, the invisible farmer, was one of the wealthiest landholders in the state. His portfolio included not just farmland, but timber rights, water sources, mineral deposits. And more than that, his family's legacy was woven into the very foundation of the region's economy. Decades ago, Ezekiel's grandfather had been one of the original investors in Grandstone Bank. He'd financed its construction during the Great Depression, helping keep the local economy alive when others fled. Over the years, the bank had grown, changed hands, rebranded. New executives came in. The original families were forgotten. But the accounts remained. The trusts remained. And Ezekiel had quietly managed them, never making noise, never seeking recognition. The billion-dollar withdrawal. It wasn't about need. It was about reallocation. Ezekiel had decided it was time to move those funds into something more meaningful. He'd been watching the valley change. Watching small farmers struggle. Watching families lose their land to men like Richard. And he'd decided to do something about it. That week, Ezekiel established a foundation. The Moore Agricultural Trust. Its mission was simple. Provide interest-free loans to small farmers. Buy back family land from corporate developers and return it to the descendants of the original owners. Fund education for rural children who wanted to study agriculture, environmental science, sustainable development. Protect the land. Protect the legacy. Protect the people who actually worked the soil. The foundation launched with an endowment of $1 billion. The same billion Ezekiel had withdrawn from Grand Stone Bank. The same billion Richard had laughed at. Richard's project collapsed within 2 weeks. Without access to the land Ezekiel controlled, the financing fell through. Investors pulled out. Partners distanced themselves. The deal that was supposed to be Richard's masterpiece became his most public failure. But worse than the financial loss was the humiliation. People talked. They always do. And the story of the farmer and the businessman spread. Some versions were exaggerated. Some were surprisingly accurate. But the core remained the same. Richard Hale had mocked a man based on his appearance and lost everything because of it. How would you handle that kind of public shame? Would you retreat? Would you lash out? Would you learn? Richard did what many men in his position do. He got angry. He blamed everyone but himself. Blamed his attorneys for not catching the land ownership issues. Blamed the bank for not warning him. Blamed Ezekiel for being deceptive. He should have said something, Richard complained to anyone who would listen. Walking around like that, pretending to be poor. It's dishonest. But deep down, Richard knew the truth. Ezekiel hadn't pretended to be anything. Richard had simply assumed. An assumption, he was learning, was the most expensive mistake a man can make. 3 months later, Richard received a letter. It came to his office in a plain envelope. No return address. Inside was a handwritten note on simple paper. It read, "Mr. Hale, I'm writing to you not out of anger, but out of hope. You judged me by my clothes. By my hands. By my silence. You saw what you wanted to see. I stayed quiet because I learned long ago that a man's worth is not proven by his words or his appearance, but by his actions. You have talent. You have intelligence. But you've built your life on the wrong foundation. I'm not your enemy. Greed is. Pride is. If you ever wish to learn a different way, my door is open. Not for business. For conversation. Sincerely, Ezekiel Moore." Richard read the letter 3 times. Then he crumpled it and threw it in the trash. But that night, lying awake in his penthouse apartment, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't stop thinking about it. He thought about his father, a carpenter who'd worked with his hands his whole life. A man Richard had once been embarrassed by. A man who wore simple clothes and drove an old truck. A man who'd saved every penny to send Richard to business school. A man Richard had barely spoken to in the last 10 years. Shame washed over him. The next morning, Richard dug the letter out of the trash. He smoothed it out. Read it again. And for the first time in a very long time, Richard Hale felt something other than pride. He felt the possibility of change. Would you have responded to that letter? Or would pride still keep you locked in your own perspective? 6 months later, on a cool morning in early autumn, a truck pulled up to Ezekiel's farm. Richard stepped out. He wasn't wearing a suit. Just jeans and a work shirt. He walked up to the porch where Ezekiel sat in a wooden chair, drinking coffee and watching the sun rise over the fields. Ezekiel looked up. He didn't seem surprised. "Mr. Hale," he said. Richard nodded. "Mr. Moore. I wanted to thank you for the letter." Ezekiel gestured to an empty chair. "Sit." Richard sat. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Richard said, "I've been thinking a lot. About what you wrote. About what I've built. And I realized. I don't even like the person I became." Ezekiel sipped his coffee. "Then become someone else." Richard laughed bitterly. It's not that simple. It is, Ezekiel said. It's just not easy. They talked for hours that day. About land. About legacy. About what it means to build something that lasts. Ezekiel didn't lecture. He just shared his story. How he'd walked away from wealth to find meaning. How he'd chosen purpose over prestige. How the richest moment of his life wasn't when his account hit a certain number, but when he helped a young family keep their farm. Richard listened. Really listened. And somewhere in that conversation, something shifted inside him. It wasn't a dramatic transformation. There were no tears or apologies. Just a quiet realization. That the life he'd been chasing was hollow. And that maybe, just maybe, there was another way. Over the following year, Richard changed. Slowly. He sold off some of his properties. Downsized his lifestyle. Started investing in restoration projects instead of destruction. He even joined the board of Ezekiel's foundation. Not as a figurehead. As someone who actually showed up and did the work. People noticed. Some praised him. Others said it was just a PR stunt. Richard didn't care anymore. Because for the first time, he was building something he was actually proud of. And Ezekiel? He continued doing exactly what he'd always done. Waking before dawn. Working the land. Speaking little. But now, when people saw him in town, they didn't just see a farmer. They saw a man who'd quietly changed the world around him without ever raising his voice. The foundation grew. Dozens of families saved their farms. Hundreds of kids went to college. Thousands of acres were protected. And it all started with a single sentence. I want to withdraw $1 billion. Not because Ezekiel needed to prove anything. But because he knew that sometimes, the only way to wake people up is to show them what they refuse to see. So let me ask you this. How many times have you judged someone by what you saw on the surface? How many times have you assumed that wealth means wisdom, or that poverty means weakness? How often do we confuse noise for power and silence for insignificance? This story is real because it happens every single day. Maybe not with billions of dollars. Maybe not in a bank. But the essence of it, the truth of it, happens in classrooms, in offices, in grocery stores, in every corner of life. We look at people and make instant decisions about who they are. What they're worth. What they can offer. And most of the time, we're wrong. Ezekiel didn't need to announce his wealth. He didn't need validation. He knew who he was. And that's the kind of freedom most of us spend our whole lives searching for. Richard, on the other hand, built his identity on what others thought of him. On status. On appearance. On being seen. And when that was stripped away, he had to face the terrifying question we all avoid. Who am I when no one's watching? Who am I when the audience is gone? This story isn't just about a farmer and a businessman. It's about all of us. It's about the choices we make when no one's keeping score. It's about whether we build empires or legacies. Whether we take or give. Whether we laugh at people or learn from them. What would you have done in that bank? If you were Richard, would you have apologized? Would you have changed? Or would pride have kept you exactly where you were? And if you were Ezekiel, would you have stayed silent all those years? Would you have extended grace to someone who mocked you? Or would bitterness have won? The beauty of this story is that it challenges both perspectives. It reminds us that power without humility is dangerous. But it also reminds us that humility without action is invisible. Ezekiel had both. He lived humbly. But when the moment came, he acted. And that action changed lives. So here's the real question. What are you building? Not what are you buying? Not what are you earning? But what are you building that will last after you're gone? Because one day, all of us will be gone. And the only thing that remains is what we chose to protect, to nurture, to give. Ezekiel understood that. Richard learned it. And maybe, if we're honest, we all need to be reminded of it. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it challenged something in you, then share it. Subscribe so you never miss another story like this. And leave a comment. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us how this story made you feel. Tell us about a time you judged someone and were wrong. Or a time someone judged you. Because these conversations matter. These moments matter. And the next story we share will shake you even more. Until then, remember this. The quietest voices often carry the loudest truth. And the most powerful people are the ones who never need to prove it.